Today on Mr. Media, I'll talk to Deborah Davis, author of the new book, Guest of Honor, Booker T. Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, and the White House Dinner That Shocked the Nation. Stick around. You don't know squat about American history if you don't know this story. Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience of blacks and whites living together in harmony. Seriously, they're right here in my living room, humming the greatest hits of Run DMC and the Beastie Boys, and it's so loud I can barely concentrate on my typing. In the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. Can a dinner change history? That's the opening line of author Deborah Davis's amazing new book, Guest of Honor, Booker T. Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, and the White House Dinner That Shocked the Nation. At its essence, Guest of Honor is about Booker T. Washington becoming, in 1901, the first African American to be a dinner guest of a sitting president in the White House. That simple meal between old friends set off a raging controversy, only 35 years past Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declaring the end of slavery. Now, I've always had a fascination with the legends and anecdotes of the modern American presidency, so this book had instant appeal for me. It also dovetailed nicely with the new book I myself am working on. It's the autobiography of a remarkably successful graduate of Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. But you don't have to care about either of those subjects to find Guest of Honor a compelling page-turner. It drips with insight and color from the turn of the 20th century, hitting its highest note in the writer's discovery of so many parallel personal tracks in the lives of Washington and Roosevelt. Now, best of all, for our often history-resistant population, this is a wonderful work that doesn't require a master's in history to enjoy. Particularly interesting is the way the roles of the Republican and Democratic parties have reversed over 100 years. The Republicans, after all, were the party that freed the slaves. Southern Democrats were the ones who fought it every step of the way. Now it's the Republicans who are often seen as racist, and the Democrats that elected and want to re-elect a black man to the presidency, all of which I find rather fascinating. And with that, Deborah Davis, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you, Bob. Glad to be here.
Oh, delighted to have you. Did I get all that pretty close to right? Did I?
Perfect.
Yeah?
And you actually, hit upon many of the topics that really fascinated me. And I was chuckling because as I was writing the book, it was really hard to keep straight who were the, quote, good guys and who were the bad guys, because I, like you, are used to, thinking of the Democrats as being the people who were more liberal and the Republicans as being the people who weren't.
I knew Lincoln was a Republican, okay, and you hear that over time, but when it actually pops up in a story like this and you realize how the roles essentially have changed so dramatically and the image of the parties, it's flabbergasting.
The roles really have changed, but the game has not changed at all. And that's something that I also found really, really interesting. Crossing the aisle was still, a big issue, even in 1901. And it was also still a game of block and tackle, with one party trying to trip up the other.
It's funny, isn't it, that every generation thinks that theirs is the most fanatical out there dealing with politics, and that, it's never been as nasty as it is now. It's never been. Yeah, it has.
Well, especially with this dinner, I have to say, the first time that I heard about the dinner, it was, you never know where inspiration will come, was when I was listening to John McCain's concession speech on that historic election night in 2008. And there was a lot of the usual, rhetoric in it, but at one point he mentioned that we've come a long way since Roosevelt entertained Booker T. Washington at the White House and it caused such a scandal. I had never heard of this. And when I started looking into it, I was just astonished by the magnitude of that scandal and the vicious headlines and the outrage that was just all over the country over one little dinner.
And you know the thing, and obviously we're going to talk about that, but the thing about McCain's speech, um, that was a moment in his speech that there weren't enough of those moments in his campaign where you
Exactly.
saw the genuineness of this man. It's kind of like years before with Bob Dole. Everyone talked about he's a great sense of humor, he's a great guy to be out with. But once some of these men get into the campaign, they lose sight of who they are. I'm getting off a little off topic, but they lose sight of who they are and their humanity and what it is about them that appeals. And if McCain had kept that tone, had maintained that type of tone, I think in his campaign, he probably would have won, despite his running mate.
Well, I think that's absolutely, a really, really good point because, you listen to a speech like that and you envision, dozens of speechwriters having been hard at work, and then you hear a story like that and you understand that, there's a shared humanity here, and that no matter what, Obama's election, even though it meant McCain's loss, was a proud moment in history.
And the man was gracious enough to recognize it.
Yes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, all right, so let's talk about this story in particular. What are the keys to the story? And it's not just, I want to explain to people that it's not. You haven't stretched out a dinner over 300 pages. There's what we would call now, or what Hollywood would call the backstory. The backstory is significant to this, and then there's what happened afterwards. But what are the keys to the story for you? What do you want people to know about this to draw them to the book?
Well, I think that what drew me to the story, and I like to think that what interests me ultimately is what will interest my reader. What drew me to it was the fascinating parallel between these two great men. We have Booker T. Washington, we have Theodore Roosevelt, and one is black, one is white. Roosevelt is obviously, president of the United States, came from a moneyed background, even an aristocratic background. Booker T. Washington, born a slave, went on to found Tuskegee, great educator. But what could these two men possibly have in common? And when I started researching their lives, I realized that they had almost exactly the same destinies and were on parallel tracks. They both faced great adversity in youth. Booker T, obviously a slave, didn't know how to read, had to teach himself, had to fight for every inch of what he won. Theodore Roosevelt, born a weakling physically, and that was something that he just hated about himself, and he worked very, very hard to overcome that. They both pursued, paths in education. They both became leaders. They both, even when they first started out as young men, they each, at the same time, married, lost their wives tragically, found themselves the fathers of infant daughters who they had no idea how to raise. And it just seemed that every step of the way, there was something that was leading them to this moment at the White House. So that was something that I really found interesting. The other thing that I found really interesting was how the dinner was a window into a world that I think we've kind of forgotten about. A moment when the door of opportunity opened for African Americans after Emancipation. And there was a whole generation of Black achievers, some of them more famous than others, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Dunbar, the poet, Scott Joplin, the ragtime composer. Here they were thinking that this was a great time to be an African American. Mm-hmm. And they accomplished so much. And then all of a sudden in 1901, that door slammed shut. These are some of the things that were discoveries for me.
Can I tell you that I honestly did not know until I read in the book that Scott Joplin was black. I had no idea. I know it seems crazy that I wouldn't know that, but it was.
But that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Isn't that a good thing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was
why should it be relevant? It's only relevant because of our history of problems.
No, and it made perfect sense. I want to take you back to something that you were talking about a minute ago. We were talking about the parallel tracks, which of course I mentioned in the intro as well. Um, I was I was astonished to read about Booker losing losing his first wife almost simultaneously, not quite, but
Hmm.
almost simultaneously with Teddy Roosevelt losing his wife, and Teddy lost his wife and mother in 24 hours, right?
On the same day, on Valentine's Day,
Ah,
no less. His wife was very, very young, and so she was living with his mother in New York City, and he was in Albany. He was working, in government, in politics, and so he commuted back and forth. And his wife was pregnant, and he got the happy telegram, the backslapping, pass out the cigars telegram that she had given birth to a daughter, and almost immediately, he received the telegram saying, "Come home, all is lost." He raced home to find his wife dying on one floor and his mother dying on another floor. And they had a double funeral a few days later, which it's an astonishing, almost, Victorian kind of story.
right, and nice piece of detail when you said that one coffin was labeled wife and one was labeled mother.
One was labeled mother,
Ah,
yes.
it's just brutal. And then, of course, Booker lost his second wife.
Yes, his first wife died. He married again, relatively soon. He had a daughter. His second wife was Olivia, was his helpmate and fellow teacher at Tuskegee. She died, and by this time he had three children. And these men were lost. It wasn't a moment to be a single father. And the problems that they experienced with having, especially infant daughters, came back to haunt them in 1901 when they woke up and found that they had, what's worse than that, teenage daughters. And,
I'll vouch for that,
Ro-
folks.
Roosevelt said famously, of his teenage daughter Alice, "I can run the country and I can run Alice, but I can't do both at the same time."
A man had my sympathy, and I think
Mine
about,
too.
man, I think about Jimmy Carter raising Amy in the White House. I just can't imagine. And now Obama raising two girls in the White House. And so I guess his older daughter must be just about a teenager, if not. Yeah, I guess she must be an early teen by now. That's got to be brutal.
Brutal,
Because
brutal.
the world stops for teenage girls. I don't know. I don't know about anyone else's experience, but it doesn't matter what else is going on in the world. What? It,
No, no, and that was Roosevelt and Booker T with Alice and Portia.
mhm.
They had to drop everything to take care of the problems with their daughters.
Well, and Booker's third wife, because he married again, did not care for Portia, and it acknowledged it right from the beginning. And
Well, this was another one of those strange parallels. Booker T's wife didn't care for his daughter, and honestly, Theodore Roosevelt's wife didn't care for her stepdaughter. She, in fact, never quite invited her to come to the White House when the family moved in. And Alice pretended that, she didn't want to go, but she said later in her journals, "They actually never asked me." And, there was that thing between the stepmother and the stepdaughter and the step teenage daughter. It was very difficult, and some things really never do change.
no, no, we can still see that in Mad Men today. That's a whole storyline with the stepmother. Sorry, I don't mean to go off track. Um, you know, in hearing about your book and then approaching it to read, I was expecting to find that Roosevelt and Washington had never met before this famous dinner, but of course that wasn't the case. They knew each other. Um, uh, Roosevelt had met him a couple times, read Washington's book. I mean, that surprised me. I was really expecting that there was going to be a big build-up, and the first meeting was going to be at the White House, but it wasn't that at all, which is part of why the reaction was so surprising.
Well, of course they knew each other because it was a very small world at the time. And if you admired someone, and they had, a degree of fame, chances are you traveled in the same circles. And understand when Booker T. Washington was in the North, he really experienced freedoms that he did not attempt to experience in the South. He lived a different existence. And he, went to clubs. He went to, the kinds of clubs that were for intellectuals. He was invited to universities. I mean, he had been given a doctorate at Harvard. And I always thought that this was a wonderful story that in the South, there was a gentleman who had a real problem with what to call Booker T. Washington, because he absolutely could not break the unwritten law of the South and call him Mr. Washington. That was not done. When Booker T. received an honorary degree from Harvard and became Dr. Washington, there was a collective sigh of relief in the South, because now he could be addressed as doctor and not Mr. And that really sums up, what the problem was. But yes, Roosevelt and Washington knew each other. They had met right after Roosevelt came home from the Spanish-American War. They wrote to each other constantly, exchanging ideas, which is what intellectuals did at the time. And whenever Roosevelt wanted advice about goings-on in the South, Booker T. was the person he would turn to. And in fact, on the very day that McKinley died and Roosevelt was sworn into office, one of the first messages he sent was to Booker T. Washington, saying, "I must speak to you. When can you come to Washington?"
Right.
So they were very, very much in contact.
Well, and that was part of as I recall, part of the reason he sent the note was that they were supposed to meet shortly thereafter. I'm trying to remember if Roosevelt was going to Tuskegee or the other way around, but
Good memory, yes, exactly.
right.
He was planning a trip to Tuskegee, and that trip had to be set aside. But what Roosevelt was even more concerned about at the moment was how to fill political appointments in the South.
Right.
He was somebody who was dead against patronage, and he really wanted to make fair appointments, and he wanted to get fair advice, which he would never get from Republicans in the South. That everybody had a cousin or somebody who, they owed a favor to. So he thought, let me bring in someone who's both impartial and knowledgeable, and that would be Booker T. Washington.
Yeah, it was really interesting. That Roosevelt. Well, actually, let me go back, because you described McKinley's death and the shooting of McKinley, and I got to back it up a little bit. You point out that it was actually an African American gentleman who probably prevented McKinley from dying sooner because he was standing in line behind the guy who shot him, and
Exactly. He here was this, African American from the South, and he's standing in line, getting ready to shake McKinley's hand, and he notices that the guy in front of him has a white handkerchief around his hand, and he doesn't think much. He thinks maybe he was injured. And then all of a sudden, there's a noise and the handkerchief starts to smoke. And he realizes that a shot has been fired. He wrestles the would-be assassin to the ground, and is credited by everybody who was there with saving the day. Now, obviously, McKinley died, about a week later, so it wasn't a save. But he did prevent the assassin from firing again. And the thing that was so interesting is that there were headlines all over the country about how, this African American saved McKinley, who was still alive. When the official report was compiled, there was no mention of him. And his name was obliterated. The Secret Service took full credit. And history has a way of moving on. And I found evidence of that several times in the book. But by the time you got to today and history books today, there's no mention of anyone wrestling the assassin to the ground. Never happened.
And I bring that up.
That was interesting.
Yeah, I bring that up only because it's a little off topic, and yet it's not. It's part of why I like the book so much. There's just a lot of these little moments dropped in there. Like I'll tell you two others that I liked. I did not know. Somehow escaped my reading of history, something as simple as Teddy Roosevelt was the guy who named the White House. It had been commonly referred to as the White House, but it didn't have an official name before Teddy. It was the president, it was the executive mansion, or whatever it was.
Yes.
And then the other thing that was interesting to journalists is that up until him, the journalists covering the president generally waited outside in the rain and the snow, whatever, for a moment with the president. He was the one who decided that they should have a room in the White House just to be, just to treat them better. Of course, he had a greater interest and respect in journalism and reporters covering the White House than perhaps his predecessors did. But I mean, it was
He
just, yeah.
loved, Roosevelt loved the press. He respected them. He met with them daily, and he often turned to them for information, which was something that really I don't think had happened before. But yes, he saw the reporters huddled in the rain and thought, this is terrible. Let's give them a room, so that they can wait inside. And yes, one of his first official duties was to name the White House. It had been called the Executive Mansion. That's what the stationery said. And his feeling was, there's an executive mansion in every state in the Union. The White House had always been nicknamed the White House, but he was the person who made the decision, let's make that the official name of the building. And that's what it was called, obviously, ever after.
You know what it got me thinking about is how old that building is, and I wonder which will be the president in the future who will decide, or his staff will decide, that it's finally time to raise that building and build a new one. And won't that be an interesting period in history?
Well, Roosevelt actually, faced some of those considerations because the building was in such poor shape when he and his family moved in that, they were appalled. The White House had a terrible problem with rats, and nobody could cure that problem. Rat hunters were brought in, people with ferrets who would, let the ferrets loose through the pipes. The cook complained that if she turned her back, clever rats would come out and drag the roast away like a corpse. This was a real problem, and it was kept under covers. But by the time Roosevelt got there, first of all, his kids loved stuff like that, so they were always happy when a rat showed up. But the Roosevelts really had to decide, how are we going to live in this house? And two things, I think. Once they moved in, it became apparent that the White House really did need a renovation. The other thing was that after the dinner, all over America, people were talking about the sanctity of the White House. They kept invoking that one of the worst outrages was that this meal, that this black man had been allowed to take dinner at the White House, which is, a national shrine. And Roosevelt must have thought, if this place is so important in the American consciousness, why does it look so bad? And isn't it time to really, make it new again? And that's exactly what they did. I mean, there was a 6-month renovation with some of the older, horrible things being taken down. The White House used to have a glass wall in it, that was actually designed by Tiffany, a multicolored glass wall. But some visitors to the White House really thought that it had been assembled from broken bottles.
Oh my
And
God.
one woman congratulated the president on his thrift, for building a wall with broken bottles. So it really needed to get renovated. And it was, and turned into the place we know it to be today.
And no doubt it'll need to be done again before too long. So I'm very interested. The reporter and journalist in me is very interested in how you put a book like this together. Obviously, not a lot of people who were at that dinner around to talk to, and it was at a time where, you talk about, I think there were Edison cameras were at certain events, World's Fairs type things, expositions, but we don't have a lot of recorded audio or video, not video, but audio or film of Teddy and Booker T. We can see that the photos in the book, the photos of the Roosevelts tend to be pretty good because they had access to that, and the photos of the Washington family tend to be not quite as good because they didn't have access to the technology of the time. So my question is, how do you research a book like this? how much stuff exists, and how much, do you have to, take the information, and sometimes you have to, I mean, conversations, for example. It's, how do you do that?
Well, it's really interesting that during this moment in time, and I've discovered this with other books that I've written, don't write a book about today. Don't write a book. Live people are horrible to work with. Write about the dead, especially the dead in a previous century, because chances are that they saved everything, that they chronicled every moment of their lives, that they wrote letters to each other, and then letters about what they said, and it's just amazing what you can find. And certainly Roosevelt kept very, very good copies of all of his correspondence, telegrams, letters. So did Booker T. Washington. And then the real gold mine is the press, because newspapers, when you were talking about a president, recorded every single thing, every story. And most of them, as I mentioned before, weren't important enough to be saved, to last in history, in our what's printed today. But if you go back, for example, when I was, studying McKinley's assassination, I just went back to all of those wonderful newspapers that are either online, digitized, or they're in collections. And that's where you find all of the anecdotal material. Same about Booker T. Washington. Everything that he did was chronicled. Everything was reported. Either he kept it or somebody else wrote about it. And I found the most extraordinary information. It was really, I wrote about, there was a wonderful incident right after Roosevelt became president, where a young boy, he was on his way to church, or coming out of church, and a young boy
story, yes,
snapped his picture with a Brownie camera. So you see something like that. I saw, it was repeated, the story was repeated in a Washington newspaper that Roosevelt had been, quote, attacked, by somebody holding a camera. I looked for more accounts of the story. I found out the child's name. And then I started thinking, well, what actually was a Brownie camera? And I researched that and found that they had just come out. And you start putting the pieces together. And I discovered that Brownie was offering a prize to kids who could come up with the best photograph. So that's what happened. This intrepid child was trying to take the president's photograph to win a prize, and then you have a story. And, then I found a quote from Roosevelt saying that, I'd rather be shot at by bullets than cameras. And it just evolves. And I think that there were many stories like that if you follow them to their root in the newspapers of the time, you really come up with a wealth of information.
Plus, you can take that forward 110 years. And, presidents, there was just a story this week that the Obama campaign is not allowing people to bring their cell phones into private functions and fundraisers with the president, because they don't want people taking out their cameras, their camera phones, and recording things that are said and then share it all over the internet. And I just thought of that when I was reading about Roosevelt stopping this little boy from taking his phone.
Yes, and actually the Roosevelt's police, from that moment on, put a ban on people taking photographs of the president on the street. So same.
Right.
Well,
and I want to be fair. I know that it's also common practice on the Republican side of things not to allow the camera phones and stuff into their private fundraising meetings as well. I don't want to get in trouble with either side here. I know that they both do that. It just happened to be in the news.
Straddle that aisle.
Yeah, you got to do what you got to do. So, we've come all this far, and we haven't talked too much about the meal itself, which of course is the topic here. And I really don't want to give too much away about that, because that's the whole point of getting people to buy the book. So I want to ask you this, and then maybe we'll kind of wrap up. So this was a big event, that having this very prominent African American to the White House for a dinner. They knew each other already, but it was still a big deal. They did not know how big a deal it was until the following day when the newspapers came out, right?
Yes, exactly. They thought it was just an ordinary evening, and they discussed business. They went their separate ways. Booker T got on a train and went to New York. They woke up, and a Washington Post reporter who routinely recorded the president's activities every day had sent out over the wire that Booker T. Washington dined at the White House. Well, this was the first time an African American had dined at the White House. Frederick Douglass had been to meetings in Lincoln's office. People like Sojourner Truth, same thing. No African American had ever sat down at the president's table. And dining in this case is actually a code word for social equality. This is why, there was such outrage, especially in the South, because if you invited a man to sit at your dinner table, essentially you were saying that he could court your daughter, he could marry her, he could enter your family, and, all people were equal. Well, this was unacceptable in the South, completely unacceptable. And when they objected to this dinner, that is what most people were objecting to.
It's kind of like many years later, the NBC show The West Wing, when the President Bartlett's assistant Charlie started dating. Charlie, for people who never watched The West Wing, was African American. Started dating the white president's daughter. That did not go over well even then, 100 years later.
Well, where African Americans can or cannot eat has been an issue. I remember the lunch counters from my childhood. It's been a battleground. This was the first instance of what ended up being tabletop segregation. It launched, a movement of tabletop segregation and gave people something to really complain about. And of course, there was a political agenda. The Democrats, who probably didn't really care if an educated African American ate at the White House, wanted something to use against Roosevelt and knew that other people would care. So it became a political weapon.
I was trying to think if there had been since then any kind of similar situation that would have caused such an outcry. I didn't sit down with history books to go through it, but I was reminded of when Jimmy Carter invited Anwar Sadat to Camp David to meet with Menachem Begin, and I wondered if that was a similar, different but similar, in that, oh my God, you're having an Arab to the White House and to Camp David. They're they're uncivilized. They're this, they're that. Well, it turned out not to be the case. But I have this memory, and I was a teenager at the time, but I seem to have this memory of that did not go over particularly well in a lot of quarters either, particularly with the Jewish community. They thought that
exactly.
was
Yeah. But the difference with this White House dinner was that it really pushed a button and widened the racial divide in this country, because for the first time, people were forced to have an opinion about social equality. And the people who were against it were really, really vocally against it and weren't, afraid to take out their feelings on the first available African American. On the other hand, the dinner gave African Americans incredible confidence to move forward and to demand their own place at the table. And there was actually something that was called, Negro aspiration. And newspapers wrote about this. They were afraid that African Americans would, start demanding to be treated like Booker T. Washington. And it was shocking. I mean, a U.S. senator actually made the statement that the dinner would necessitate killing 1,000 blanks, I can't say that word, before all those blanks would know their place again. Booker T. Washington had given them ideas. The second that he sat down at the president's table, he encouraged other African Americans to ask for that kind of equality.
Wow. Well, folks, listen, this is quite a book. I can't recommend it enough. I've enjoyed talking to Deborah about it. And let me tell you that you can find Deborah Davis's new book, Guest of Honor, Booker T. Washington, Theodore Roosevelt, and the White House Dinner That Shocked the Nation. It's in great bookstores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price here at mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. Deborah, do you have a website or Twitter or Facebook, any of those things people can come and find out more or talk
I
contact you?
don't, but I'm happy if they go to Mr. Media.
Fair enough. All right, that sounds good. Um, are you at work on another book yet, or too soon?
I am. I've switched, centuries. I'm working on a book called The Trip, which is about Andy Warhol's trip cross country in 1963, which is kind of like The Hangover, but in an earlier time. And it's a really fun subject.
On the road with Andy, huh?
On the road with Andy.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to hearing about that when that comes out. And Deborah Davis, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Media, today. Fun show.
Thank you so much. I had a great time.
For more original interviews, surf over to our main website, mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. If you've enjoyed today's show, subscribe for free to Mr. Media via email, RSS, or iTunes, and you'll never miss a show. Another good idea, download our new free Mr. Media mobile app in the Android market. You can also listen with a piece of string and a tin can in many parts of the internet. Show your support of Mr. Media by supporting our sponsors, including Audible. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/radio. Again, that's audibletrial.com/radio for your free audiobook. We're also supported by thepartyauthority.us. Call DJ Ira for all your party entertainment needs nationwide at 1-800-DIAL-DJs or visit their website, thepartyauthority.us. If you've got an idea for a guest, a comment on today's show, or would like to advertise on Mr. Media Radio, email me directly at bob@mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. You can also call our 24-hour listener line at 1-727-498-4711. Some messages may be used in an upcoming show, and unless you live next door to Mr. Media, there may be a toll charge. You can also follow Mr. Media on Facebook, Twitter, or our new YouTube and Vimeo video channels. Thanks so much for joining us today. I always appreciate you sharing a piece of your day with Mr. Media. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Hey everybody, this is Bob Andelman from Mr. Media. First of all, I want to thank you for years of support listening to this show. We're starting our 6th year, it's hard to believe, our 6th year as 2012 starts, and heading towards our 1,000th online podcast, audio and video. It's pretty amazing, frankly. I remember starting it several years ago thinking this will never last. And podcast, that's as stupid a word as blogging. But here we are, starting our 6th year and heading up to 1,000 interviews. And I want to thank everybody for listening and supporting the show. I also want to tell you that one of the things that's been very helpful for this show is Stitcher Radio. Yes, this is sort of a commercial. Now, there are millions of smartphone apps in the world, but I only use one several times a day, Stitcher Radio. I build my own radio station to listen to broadcast and online shows when I want and in the order I want. CNN News Update, Onion Radio News, WTF with Mark Maron, MSNBC's Morning Joe, Studio 60, the TechCrunch headlines, and of course, Mr. Media. It's free. It works on iPhone, Android, BlackBerry, Palm Pre, and much more. And you can get it for free for yourself. Try it out. I guarantee you're going to love it. Stitcher.com/MRmedia. That's Stitcher.com/Mr. Media. You're going to love it. And thanks again for supporting